Hello everyone of the Midwest and the US of A, the Great Lakes Railroader is back. Now I'm going to go straight to the point, and that's these Vandalized Heritage units. I've been hearing about them recently, and as I've heard about the third CSX diesel being the third target, I needed to look into this. So we're going to jump straight into the video to share with you guys and the rail fan community about what I discovered. CSX has had heritage units rolling out of their paint shop in Waycross, Georgia, but has also received some criticism about them, such as the first few units they did with a fade, where it transitions from the colors of the CSX. Then, at 3/4 the rest of the way, the fade transitions to the colors of where CSX came from. The fade was eventually phased out as it continues with many of its heritage units. They have unveiled many heritage units, including the Chessie system, the RF&P, L&N, and more, with probably some more coming in the future. However, the Chessie system, RF&P, L&N, and the others that are on the rails today are official CSX paint jobs, unlike the heritage locos that I have been hearing about. There's something else happening out there in CSX territory. In this case, 3 CSX EMD diesels have fallen to vandalism within almost a year since the first one was vandalized in August of 2023. Normally, we see train cars that have graffiti on them. Though creative as it is, the vandals that do this might be trespassing on railroad property and eventually getting away with it. I've been keeping track with these events of these so-called vandalized heritage units via V12 Productions and Facebook. The image of the Chessie system nose on CSX 6914 I've seen on the CSX Equipment Updates Facebook group, a group unaffiliated with CSX, was, as I quote, "I won't lie, the nose of the locomotive is well painted, but either way, it's still trespassing and vandalism." Whoever did this must have heard about CSX's new locomotives in heritage paint jobs. However, most comments I've seen think it to be cool how the vandalist is expertly doing this. While one comment on the RF&P Vandalized Heritage Unit post back in November of 2023 says, "The Heritage Bandits strike again." That sounds to be the right name for whoever is doing this. Now, the most recent CSX diesel to fall victim to the heritage vandalism spree is CSX 2625. This time, it's in the paint style of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. Over the 10 months I was following the heritage vandalism events, I came up with a couple of theories, stating it might also be possible that this trespasser is targeting random or specific EMD switcher cabs. Let's take a look at the 3 CSX diesels that have been vandalized so far. Already, CSX Transportation has CSX number 1973 in the heritage paint scheme of the Chessie system. They announced their unveiling of the Chessie Heritage Unit back in June of 2023. 2 months later, in August of 2023, CSX 6914's nose was vandalized in the style of the Chessie system. The first time I've heard about this was from V12 Productions. There was no press release from CSX about this, as V12 Productions mentioned it in the video I've seen. So, it was most likely vandalism, and it looks professionally made too. Since I've heard about CSX 2625 being the next target for the Heritage Bandits, I've decided that I better do some research. Using the dieselshop.us website, 6914, an EMD GP40-2, was once part of the Chesapeake in Ohio between C&O running numbers 4392 through 4396, or 4401 through 4421. It held its running number when the Chessie system added these GP40-2s to C&O's fleet. It would eventually be renumbered as 6914 we see today, now having the nose in the style of the Chessie. Earlier before this Vandalized Heritage unit spree, I looked through a box that had some of my old books packed away when me and my family moved. I soon came across my first train book I got back on Christmas Day, a little over a decade ago. Up to the present day, I looked to see if there was information about the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Chessie system. According to the book, the C&O had a vast number of GP units, but they only had GP7s, GP9s, SD18s, and SD40s. This was thought to be a dead end when it looked like the C&O didn't have any GP40-2s in their roster. Until a lucky break. The Chessie system came into the world in 1973 as a holding company for the Chesapeake and Ohio, Baltimore and Ohio, and Western Maryland railroads. Looking back to the days of the C&O before the Chessie, they never really did have any GP40-2s in their roster. It looks to be that the C&O had some GP40-2s added to their fleet during the days of the Chessie system in the 1970s. C&O's GP40-2s would eventually be absorbed into CSX and renumbered to the 6900 series. However, this was just the beginning, as another CSX unit would fall to vandalism. 3 months later, as CSX 6914 was vandalized, another GP40-2 diesel unit fell to vandalism. This time, it was CSX 6394 who fell victim to vandalism in November of 2023. Its nose was painted in the style of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Like the nose of 6914, the nose of 6394 looks to be expertly done. I did some research on 6394 and I found something interesting, both from the two websites and in my book on the RF&P. The dieselshop.us website showed that GP40-2 numbers 6393 through 6399 were in fact ex-RF&P number 141 through 147 on the CSX present-day roster, and vice versa. The RF&P roster shows RF&P number 141 through 147 were renumbered to CSX 6393 through 6399. But in the notes section, we can see that 3 of the 7 GP40-2s were renumbered from the 6300 series to the 6500 series. Now it looks like there are only 4 GP40-2s in the 6300 series remaining, with 6394 being the second target to fall to vandalism. What's more is that not only I did some research on the dieselshop.us website, I also did some research in my book. I looked to see if the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad was in my book. As a matter of fact, it was in there, and I found something that caught my eye about the railroad. In 1972, the RF&P bought 7 GP40-2s from EMD as a result of Amtrak taking over passenger service, thus ending RF&P's passenger services and their need for passenger power. More about the RF&P is another story. In short, the RF&P bought 7 new GP40-2s, which would eventually be absorbed into CSX. Also, the photos on railpictures.net says it all, as we can see them taken by different photographers. The Heritage Bandits would soon strike again, only the next diesel wouldn't be a GP40-2. Before the second so-called Vandalized Heritage unit, I had a theory as to why these Heritage Bandits would be doing this. Whoever this person or persons are, might be targeting random CSX EMD switcher cabs. This was only one theory that I stated earlier in the video. However, that theory would soon be ruled out. We now turn to the most recent vandalized heritage unit, CSX number 2625, an EMD GP38-2. This time, the nose is in the style of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. The GP38-2, that happens to be the third target, blew my targeting random diesels theory. According to the dieselshop.us website, 2625 served the seaboard system between seaboard system numbers 4115 through 4124. However, these GP38-2s were originally part of the L&N, as these were probably new diesels for their road service in the 1970s. I looked to see what railpictures.net had about the L&N, and there were in fact units in the 4100 series, specifically between 4115 through 4124. The L&N would become a part of the family line system and eventually the seaboard system, still holding the same running numbers. They would soon be renumbered to the 2600 series today, such as 2625 we see now. Before moving on, I like to take a look at an official nose paint job. Now, out of the paint jobs I've seen, there is one in particular that I've actually seen. I've seen CSX EMD SD40-3 number 4070 that had the usual blue and yellow in Holland of 2023. Pretty usual to see. But in 2022, I saw CSX 4384 with an unusual nose paint job that I've never seen before. This nose paint job was done in the style of the Clinchfield Railroad for CSX's Santa Train in 2016. The best part about it was that it was an official paint job from what I've seen and heard. When word of these so-called vandalized heritage units got out, most people must have been delighted to see and hear, possibly even the railfan community too, while some others, including CSX most likely, were probably thinking, how can this have happened? And why? Well, let's look back to see why. After doing some research on the past 3 now vandalized EMD locomotives, I found a connection as to why the heritage bandits have targeted these specific locos. This would also prove a second theory I have thought of. First off, CSX announced their unveiling of their Chessie heritage unit back in June of 2023. But doing some more digging, CSX released their first heritage unit back in May of 2023, the Baltimore and Ohio heritage unit. A month later, CSX would release the Chessie heritage unit. 3 more official heritage units would be released later on down the line. 3 months later, CSX 6914's nose was vandalized in the style of the Chessie. CSX 6914 just so happens to have been added to the C&O's fleet when it served the Chessie system in 1973. Earlier, before becoming part of the Chessie, the C&O didn't have any GP40-2s in their roster. This was because the GP40-2 wasn't around until being produced by EMD in 1972. 3 months later, in November of 2023, CSX 6394 was the next target for the Heritage Bandits. Its nose would be painted in the style of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. The RF&P have been dieselizing its fleet between the late 1940s to the early 1950s, buying diesel units from EMD. This included F units and GP7s for freight service, and E units for passenger service. But since Amtrak took over in 1971, passenger service from the RF&P was eliminated. 1 year later, in 1972, the RF&P ordered 7 new GP40-2s to their fleet. To add to that, it looked like the RF&P's 7 GP40-2s didn't have any dynamic brake fans, which looks to be a sign that the 7 GP40-2s the RF&P bought didn't have any dynamic brake controls installed. 5 months later, in May of 2024, CSX 2625 became the third target for the Heritage Bandits. Its nose was painted in the style of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. The L&N purchased GP38-2s and SD40-2s from EMD in the 1970s, as both these diesels dominated the rails in freight service. L&N's GP38-2s and SD40-2s overcame its older EMDs and Alco units that were bought in the 1960s. The L&N would eventually become part of the Seaboard Coastline later on in the 1970s, becoming a part of the Family Line system and eventually the Seaboard system. All the locomotives that were part of these now fallen flag railroads are now part of the CSX. From what I can research, CSX has inherited many of these EMDs which still live on. I've done extensive research on CSX's locomotive roster to see if any diesels were still on the rails. It turns out it has a lot of EMD locos on its roster, mostly GP38-2s and GP40-2s, and some SD40-2s, most of which were part of its predecessor railroads. I've also looked to see which ones the Heritage Bandits have yet to hit. This list shows the road numbers of diesels on CSX's present-day roster that have yet to be the next target, and where they originated. Please note that the Louisville and Nashville and the Seaboard Coastline became the Family Lines and eventually the Seaboard. Also, EMD locos on the Seaboard system were from its 2 predecessor railroads, as well as the L&N. Also, some of these EMDs, like the GP38s/GP38-2s, were upgraded to GP38-3s, including the GP40s/GP40-2s, which were upgraded to GP40-3s in CSX's Locomotive Rehabilitation Program. Some GP40s, as well as GP30s and GP35s, were converted to road slugs to this very day. The older GPs the predecessor railroads had were most likely scrapped, as no other information about them exists. Now about the second theory I had. After looking into the 2 vandalized heritage locomotives and the most recent one, I began to see a pattern emerging. Earlier, I thought of a second theory as to why these heritage bandits have targeted these 3 diesels. These heritage bandits seem to be targeting specific locos in CSX's fleet, most specifically their fleet of EMDs. So far, the heritage bandits are targeting the GPs. CSX has been releasing General Electric units with the heritage paint job on them. In a comment on Facebook on the Vandalized Chessie unit post I left stated, "Whoever did this must have heard about CSX's new heritage locomotives." After the research I've done and busting one theory, it seems that these heritage bandits are targeting CSX's EMD cab switchers that have worked for its predecessor railroads. The research clearly reinforces my targeting specific CSX locomotives theory. Looking at both the official heritage unit and the vandalized heritage unit, there's a big difference. The official unit is painted 3/4 of the way displaying its predecessor railroad, while 1/4 displayed the colors of the CSX, the Heritage bandits did the opposite. They vandalized the nose a quarter of the way, while leaving the other 3/4 of the diesel alone. Now it's only a matter of time until the Heritage bandits strike again, and I'm hoping there won't be a fourth vandalized Heritage unit, but if there already is, I'm hoping there won't be a fifth one. After doing extensive research on these vandalized Heritage units, I found that my results were conclusive. Also, I'm not sure how this will reach CSX transportation or if an investigation is being conducted by them from the recent vandalized locos. But I hope that by sharing my findings would help them out in any way possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, and hopefully those Heritage bandits are caught soon.
Where is it?